Broad spectrum, internal limitations versus external constraints. Condemn the confession if it sounds bitter. History is full of thinkers who discovered the same humiliating truth: the human mind loves its illusions more than reality. Socrates walked through Athens asking questions and was condemned because people preferred certainty to doubt. Frederick Douglass wrote that the chains on the body are easier to see than the chains on the mind. Frantz Fanon observed that colonized people sometimes internalize the very myths that diminish them. George Orwell warned that repeated lies eventually begin to feel like common sense. Each of them confronted the same enemy: the human habit of believing stories simply because those stories are familiar. Human communities construct meaning through shared symbols, myths, and everyday practices. Families teach children how to interpret the world: what counts as truth, what counts as honor, what counts as shame. These cultural scripts provide belonging, but they also create blind spots. People learn to defend the narrative of their group even when the narrative stops explaining reality. This is where impaired insight begins. Individuals grow comfortable inside familiar explanations. They repeat the same stories about politics, religion, and identity without examining whether those stories still match the world around them. When new evidence appears, it feels threatening because it disrupts the coherence of the narrative. Instead of investigating further, people retreat into the comfort of repetition. Echo chambers thrive in this environment. Modern communication systems reward agreement rather than reflection. Communities gather around voices that confirm their assumptions. Over time, disagreement begins to feel like hostility. Cultural pride becomes rigid, and questioning inherited beliefs is treated as betrayal. Existential avoidance then becomes the dominant social habit. People avoid confronting difficult realities: global hunger, economic instability, historical exploitation, because those realities challenge their comforting worldview. Some insist the world is unchanged since their youth. Others believe salvation will come from ideology or religion alone. Meanwhile, nearly 1 billion people still struggle with famine and displacement. Invincible ignorance spreads quietly. Information exists, but curiosity weakens. Individuals prefer explanations that protect their identity rather than those that reveal uncomfortable truths. Migrant communities are not immune to this problem. Some carry traditions across borders without questioning whether those traditions help their children navigate new environments. Pride replaces reflection. Loyalty replaces dialogue. But the same blindness exists in host societies. Stereotypes about immigrants circulate until they feel natural. Complex histories are reduced to simple blame. The manifesto demands something rare: intellectual humility. Human culture survives through dialogue, through the exchange of ideas, criticism, and reinterpretation. When conversation disappears, communities become trapped in their own myths. The real struggle is not between nations or ethnic groups. It is between awareness and denial. Every generation must decide whether it will repeat inherited illusions or examine them with courage. If we refuse to confront our own ignorance, the cycle continues. If we choose dialogue instead, we may finally begin to see the limits of what we think we know.
If wisdom came earlier, maybe my steps would have been different. Instead, I learned the long way. Through blame, silence, never open. People preach effort, but hide the rules of the game. Some of us grow up chasing approval and systems never meant for our victory. So now I study motives, guard my my trust and carry the quiet lesson. Survival isn't always about winning, sometimes it's about seeing clearly, yeah, and refusing to be used again.
Broad Spectrum, Internal Limitations versus External Constraints, Part 2. Condemn the testimony if it sounds cynical. History is filled with people who discovered the same unsettling pattern. Human beings prefer coherent stories over uncomfortable evidence. The mind does not search for truth first, it searches for familiarity. When a belief is repeated long enough, it becomes part of the cultural fabric. Communities pass it down through conversation, rituals, and daily habits until it feels natural, even when it is inaccurate. Many thinkers recognized this long before modern psychology gave it a name. Michel de Montaigne warned that the greatest human weakness is confidence without knowledge. W.B. Du Bois observed that societies often judge individuals not by their character but by inherited myths about race and belonging. Hannah Arendt described how ordinary people can participate in harmful systems simply by accepting the dominant narrative of their environment. Each of them encountered the same phenomenon. Communities can become trapped inside shared illusions. Human groups survive through shared meaning. Families, neighborhoods, and nations create stories about who they are and how the world works. These stories shape identity and behavior. But when these narratives stop evolving, they become rigid. Cultural identity becomes a shield protecting old assumptions rather than a tool for understanding new conditions. This rigidity creates impaired insight. People stop questioning the explanations they inherited. Older generations sometimes believe the social and economic world remains exactly as it was decades earlier. Yet the global landscape has transformed dramatically. Financial systems have shifted, labor markets have become unstable, and entire regions face new forms of economic pressure. Since the late 20th century, waves of inflation, unemployment, and recession have reshaped everyday life. Still, many individuals prefer nostalgia over analysis. Existential avoidance appears when people refuse to confront uncomfortable realities. It is easier to believe that life is a celebration without consequences, or that spiritual rescue will solve economic crisis. These beliefs provide emotional comfort, but they do not feed hungry populations or repair fragile institutions. Meanwhile, nearly 1 billion people continue living under conditions of severe hunger and deprivation. Another force strengthens this blindness: echo chambers. Communities increasingly gather around voices that confirm their existing worldview. Media, social networks, and political movements reinforce these bubbles of agreement. Within these spaces, disagreement is treated as hostility rather than curiosity. The result is vincible ignorance, ignorance that could be corrected through open discussion but survives because questioning feels threatening. Migrant communities sometimes reproduce the same pattern. People carry traditions across borders without examining how those traditions interact with new environments. Pride becomes a defense mechanism. Cultural loyalty is used to silence internal criticism. But refusing to examine inherited habits does not protect dignity, it limits adaptation. Host societies also contribute to the problem. Simplified stereotypes about immigrants circulate until they feel like common sense. Complex histories of colonial extraction, political interference, and global economic inequality disappear from the conversation. The manifesto therefore calls for intellectual honesty. Human cultures have always evolved through dialogue. Shared meals, storytelling, and debate once allowed communities to adjust their beliefs as circumstances changed. When these practices disappear, societies become trapped in their own narratives. The struggle between internal limitations and external constraints continues. Systems shape behavior, but individuals also shape the stories they choose to repeat. Awareness begins when people recognize that the most dangerous blindness is not ignorance itself, but the refusal to examine it.
If wisdom came earlier, maybe my steps would have been different. Instead, I learned the long way. Through blame, silence, never open. People preach effort, but hide the rules of the game. Some of us grow up chasing approval and systems never meant for our victory. So now I study motives, guard my trust, and carry the quiet lesson. Survival isn't always about winning, sometimes it's about seeing clearly, yeah, and refusing to be used again.
Broad Spectrum, Internal Limitations versus External Constraints, Part 3. Condemn this confession if it sounds uncomfortable. History has never been kind to those who expose the habits of the human mind. Yet many thinkers reach the same unsettling discovery. People are not only limited by the systems around them, but by the shortcuts inside their own brains. Socrates once said that the beginning of wisdom is recognizing ignorance. For this he was mocked, then condemned. Malcolm X described how people are trained to see the world through lenses placed over their minds by family, media, and institutions. James Baldwin warned that the most dangerous thing in society is the refusal to examine inherited beliefs. These voices lived in different centuries, but they encountered the same pattern. Communities defend their narratives even when those narratives no longer explain reality. The human brain searches for patterns and belonging. It releases small bursts of reward when we hear ideas that confirm our identity and our group. This reward system makes agreement feel safe. It also makes disagreement feel threatening. Over time, entire communities gather around the same explanations, repeating them until they sound like truth. This is how echo chambers form. Inside these circles, people rarely encounter information that challenges them. Familiar ideas travel quickly through conversation, family expectations, religious sermons, and digital platforms. Each repetition strengthens the feeling that the belief must be correct. The brain confuses familiarity with evidence. Impaired insight follows naturally. People become convinced they understand the world while quietly ignoring information that contradicts their narrative. They judge others according to simplified categories: successful or lazy, loyal or disloyal, believer or enemy. Yet the criteria used to judge others often say more about the story inside the mind than about reality itself. Many individuals ask where education and growth truly come from. Some believe schools or religious institutions alone produce wisdom. But knowledge is also shaped by curiosity, discussion, and the willingness to question authority. Without these habits, even formal education can reproduce the same narrow assumptions that limit communities. Internal limitations often grow quietly within families. Parents and elders pass down attitudes formed through their own experiences of hardship. Sometimes these lessons help children survive. Other times they trap them inside outdated beliefs. When young people challenge these assumptions, conflict appears between generations. Some adults respond with guidance and openness. Others respond with pride and resistance. Existential avoidance begins here. Rather than examining their own mistakes, individuals blame outside forces or retreat into defensive identities. Communities split into two camps: those who read to understand and those who read only to confirm what they already believe. One group searches for meaning beyond its comfort zone. The other group protects its worldview by rejecting unfamiliar ideas. Invincible ignorance spreads when information exists but people refuse to engage with it. Pride, fear of shame, and loyalty to the group can make learning feel dangerous. Migrant communities sometimes fall into this pattern as well. People carry traditions across borders and defend them without asking whether those traditions help their children succeed in a different social environment. Yet host societies are not innocent either. Simplified stereotypes about foreigners circulate until they feel natural. Instead of dialogue, suspicion grows. The manifesto therefore demands something difficult: intellectual humility and open conversation. The brain is capable of reflection, empathy, and learning. But these capacities require effort. They require individuals to question their own assumptions and to listen to perspectives outside their cultural circle. The struggle between internal limitations and external constraints continues every day. Systems shape behavior, but the mind shapes the stories that justify those systems. If people refuse to examine those stories, the cycle of ignorance and misunderstanding will continue across generations. Awareness begins when individuals accept a simple truth: the most dangerous blindness is the belief that we already see clearly.
If wisdom came earlier, maybe my steps would have been different. Instead I learned the long way, through blame, silence, never open. People preach effort but hide the rules of the game. Some of us grow up chasing approval and systems never meant for our victory. So now I study motives, guard my trust, and carry the quiet lesson. Survival isn't always about winning, sometimes it's about seeing clearly, and refusing to be used again.
Broad spectrum, internal limitations versus external constraints. Part 4. Condemn the confession if it sounds cruel. Condemn the observation if it exposes too much about the human mind. Yet the same pattern has haunted many thinkers across centuries. People rarely change their beliefs because of evidence. They change them because their social world demands it. The mind is not a pure instrument of truth. It is a survival tool shaped by belonging, fear, reward, and habit. Socrates discovered this when he questioned the certainties of Athens. His neighbors preferred confident stories to honest doubt. Frederick Douglass observed how entire populations could be trained to accept injustice simply by repeating a narrative of inferiority. Frantz Fanon wrote about the psychological scars that appear when people begin to believe the myths imposed on them. Each voice confronted the same uncomfortable fact: communities can become prisoners of their own stories. The human brain seeks recognition and safety. When a familiar idea appears, the brain signals comfort. When an unfamiliar idea appears, the brain produces tension and caution. This is why repetition is powerful. A statement repeated often enough becomes easy for the brain to process. Ease of processing is mistaken for truth. Echo chambers grow from this habit. Families, neighborhoods, and online networks repeat the same beliefs until they feel natural. The brain rewards agreement with a sense of belonging. It punishes disagreement with anxiety or exclusion. Over time, people stop examining their beliefs because questioning them risks losing social approval. Impaired insight develops quietly. People become confident in explanations that are never tested. They judge others according to simple stories: hardworking or lazy, loyal or disloyal, enlightened or ignorant. Yet the confidence behind these judgments often reflects the strength of the story rather than the strength of the evidence. Many individuals ask where education truly begins. Some assume that schools or religious institutions alone produce wisdom. But learning also comes from reflection, discussion, and exposure to unfamiliar perspectives. Without these experiences, formal education can become another system that repeats the same narrow assumptions. Internal limitations often arise from early experience. Parents and caregivers pass down lessons shaped by their own struggles. Some teach patience, responsibility, and curiosity. Others transmit fear, resentment, or short-term thinking. When young people grow up surrounded by pessimistic expectations, their brains adapt. They begin to see the future as limited, even when opportunities exist. Existential avoidance follows. Instead of confronting difficult questions about identity, responsibility, and growth, individuals retreat into simpler explanations. They blame outsiders, political systems, or fate without examining their own habits. Pride protects these narratives. Criticism feels like a personal attack rather than an invitation to reflect. Vincible ignorance spreads in this environment. Information exists: books, research, conversations, but people avoid it because it challenges their identity. Migrant communities sometimes fall into this pattern as well. Cultural loyalty can transform into blind obedience. Traditions are repeated without examining whether they help the next generation thrive in a different social landscape. Host societies mirror the same blindness. Simplified stereotypes about immigrants circulate until they feel like common sense. The manifesto, therefore, calls for a difficult discipline: conscious reflection. The human mind can learn. It can pause before reacting, question its assumptions, and recognize when familiarity is mistaken for truth. This requires humility and dialogue between communities rather than isolation. The real struggle is not only between external constraints and social structures. It is also within the mind itself. When people accept that they might be blind to their own blindness, the possibility of genuine understanding finally begins.
If wisdom came earlier, maybe my steps would have been different. Instead, I learned the long way. Through blame, silence, never open. People preach effort, but hide the rules of the game. Some of us grow up chasing approval in systems never meant for our victory. So now I study motives, guard my trust, and carry the quiet lesson. Survival isn't always about winning, sometimes it's about seeing clearly, and refusing to be used again.
Broad Spectrum, Internal Limitations versus External Constraints, Part 5. Condemn this confession if it sounds harsh. Many thinkers across history discovered the same bitter truth. The human mind does not naturally search for truth. It searches for safety and belonging. When a belief is repeated often enough, the brain begins to treat it as familiar. Familiarity feels comfortable, and comfort feels like truth. Socrates tried to break this habit by asking questions in the streets of Athens. He showed people that their certainty was often built on weak reasoning. Instead of gratitude, he received hostility. George Orwell warned that political systems survive not only through force, but through the repetition of simple stories that people accept without thinking. Frantz Fanon observed how communities under pressure sometimes internalize harmful narratives about themselves. Each of them discovered the same problem. People can become blind to their own blindness. The human brain reacts strongly to social signals. Approval from the group activates reward circuits. Rejection triggers stress responses, fear, isolation, and discomfort. Because of this, individuals often add just their opinions to match the majority around them. Agreement feels safe. Disagreement feels dangerous. This is how echo chambers grow. Inside these social circles, people repeat the same explanations about the world. Familiar ideas circulate again and again until they feel obvious. The brain stops examining them because questioning them threatens group belonging. People begin to answer complex problems with simple stories that protect their identity. Impaired insight develops quietly. Individuals become confident that they understand society while ignoring evidence that contradicts their narrative. When difficult questions appear, the mind often replaces them with easier ones. Instead of asking why poverty exists, people ask who to blame. Instead of examining their own habits, they criticize outsiders. Many individuals face defeat in life, loss, heartbreak, economic struggle. These experiences produce stress in the brain. Under stress, people often search for quick relief rather than careful reflection. Some join groups that promise certainty. Others turn to substances, crime, or constant distraction to escape emotional pain. Immediate pleasure becomes easier than long-term growth. Existential avoidance follows. People stop confronting deeper questions about identity, responsibility, and purpose. They hide inside political slogans, social trends, or rigid traditions. Speaking honestly becomes risky because communities punish anyone who disrupts the dominant narrative. Invincible ignorance spreads in this environment. Information exists, books, research, conversation, but people avoid it because learning requires humility. Pride blocks reflection. Migrant communities can fall into this pattern when cultural loyalty turns into blind obedience. Traditions are repeated without examining whether they help younger generations adapt to new environments. Host societies are not immune to the same habit. Stereotypes about foreigners circulate until they appear natural. Complex human experiences are reduced to simplified labels. The manifesto demands something difficult: awareness. The brain is capable of empathy, curiosity, and learning. But these abilities require individuals to tolerate discomfort and question their own beliefs. Dialogue between communities is the only way to weaken the echo chambers that isolate people. The real struggle is not only external, between institutions, borders, or economies. It is internal. When people recognize the limits of their own understanding, they begin the slow work of building clearer perception. Awareness begins with a simple admission. The stories we repeat about the world are often reflections of our fears, rather than reflections of reality.
If wisdom came earlier, maybe my steps would have been different. Instead, I learned the long way. Through blame, silence, never open. People preach effort, but hide the rules of the game. Some of us grow up chasing approval, and systems never meant for our victory. So now I study motives, guard my trust, and carry the quiet lesson. Survival isn't always about winning, sometimes it's about seeing clearly, yeah, and refusing to be used again.
Broad Spectrum, Internal Limitations versus External Constraints, Part 6. Condemn the confession if it sounds ruthless. History is filled with thinkers who discovered the same humiliating truth. The human mind prefers familiar illusions over uncomfortable evidence. People rarely reject falsehood because it is false. They reject it only when it threatens their sense of belonging. Repetition transforms stories into beliefs, and beliefs into identity. Socrates recognized this when he questioned the certainties of Athens. Instead of gratitude, he received hostility and eventually death. James Baldwin observed how societies protect comforting myths even when those myths produce injustice. Frantz Fanon described how people living under psychological pressure can internalize destructive narratives about themselves and others. Each of them encountered the same mental pattern. Communities construct stories that protect their pride, even when those stories distort reality. The human brain responds strongly to social approval. When our opinions match the group around us, the brain releases signals of reward and safety. When our ideas challenge the group, the brain triggers stress responses: fear, tension, isolation. Because of this biological mechanism, many individuals adjust their thinking to maintain acceptance rather than to pursue truth. This is how echo chambers grow. Families, social circles, and online networks repeat the same explanations about morality, religion, politics, and identity. Familiar ideas circulate constantly. Over time, the brain stops questioning them because questioning feels risky. Familiarity becomes confused with truth. Impaired insight begins here. Individuals become convinced they understand the world while quietly ignoring contradictory evidence. Anyone who displays self-awareness, curiosity, or introspection is often treated as suspicious or disruptive. Growth-minded individuals are labeled arrogant, rebellious, or mentally unstable simply because they question inherited assumptions. Inside dysfunctional families, this pattern becomes even stronger. Children raised in environments filled with jealousy, mockery, and hidden resentment often learn that authenticity is dangerous. Expressing honest thoughts may trigger ridicule or punishment. The brain adapts by suppressing curiosity and replacing it with caution. Existential avoidance follows. Rather than confronting painful family dynamics or harmful cultural habits, people hide behind rigid interpretations of religion, tradition, or authority. Simplified slogans replace nuanced understanding. Distorted interpretations of sacred texts become tools to justify harmful behavior. Invincible ignorance spreads in this environment. Information exists, books, education, and conversation, but pride prevents engagement. Individuals protect their worldview even when it clearly harms the next generation. Communities reproduce the same cycles of misinformation and emotional neglect. Migrant communities sometimes repeat these patterns in new environments. Cultural pride can transform into blind obedience. Children raised between cultures are told to respect traditions without examining whether those traditions support healthy development. Host societies contribute to the same blindness through stereotypes and suspicion. The result is mutual misunderstanding. Human beings possess the ability to reflect, empathize, and revise their beliefs. But these abilities require humility. They require people to admit that their understanding may be incomplete. This manifesto demands a difficult discipline, honest dialogue. Families must confront their internal dysfunction rather than hiding it behind pride. Communities must examine traditions critically rather than defending them blindly. Host societies must challenge stereotypes rather than repeating them. The struggle between internal limitations and external constraints will always exist. Systems shape behavior, but the mind shapes the stories that justify those systems. Awareness begins when individuals recognize the uncomfortable truth. The greatest obstacle to knowledge is not lack of intelligence, but the refusal to question the stories we inherited.
Yeah. Political fire, street intellect, sociocultural reflections in effect. History repeats, people forget, truth heavy, can't avoid what's next. We'll mourn the dead, ancestors bled, generations paid price, tears shed. We mourn the dead, voices silenced by greed. Italian roots stomping Libyan seed, colonized land, culture stripped and confined. Genocide hidden, nations left blind. The 1980 influenza pandemic, bodies stacked high, young, strong, and old. Spanish flu spread, families torn apart. Social panic, souls wounded in heart. Great Depression brought famine and fear. Economic collapse, crowds drowned in tears. Unemployment high, lives on thin ice. Poverty spread wide, dreams paid the price. Anthropology teaches societies break. Under pressure, unity can't stay fake. Lessons unlearned, repeat tragedy. Ignoring history breeds more agony. We mourn the dead, premature grave dug deep. 45 million souls every year we reap. Preventable losses, humanity blind. Neglecting healthcare, support undefined. Affordable homes, mental health declined. No safety nets, poverty aligned. Social systems cracked, education low. No financial aid, generations won't grow. Colonial scars and generational pain. Italian occupation, Libya in chains. Resource extraction, cultural race, political silence. Lives disgrace, society constructed by violence and war. Economic disparity rotten at core. Still resilience grows from despair's deep seed. Community strength is what we need. We mourn the dead over overdose, suicide, cancer, violence, tragedies, worldwide homicide spreads. Alcohol, drugs consumed, the hope fades fast, future presumed, doomed. Yet hope lives quietly beneath concrete sky. Discipline, courage, we refuse to die. Intelligence rises, energy restored. Toxic environment we won't afford. Social cultural shifts, lessons profound. Understanding history, new pathways found. Strength through adversity, unity thrives. Honoring memory of sacrificed lives. We mourn the dead, yet still we survive. Honoring those gone, keep hope alive. No more excuses, humanity awake. Building some torch systems, less pain, less ache. Praying this year, tragedies decrease. Living with purpose, dignity and peace.